interviewing top talent in movies, television, sports, and music, leaders, entrepreneurs, and experts. Broadcast in over 30 countries out of New York, Manchester, Los Angeles. As a mentor, life and career coach, I help others, athletes, actors, and people of all walks of life, solve the problems they face by introducing balance and routines that would otherwise leave them stuck and overthinking, paralyzed, unable to reach their goals. They look for engaging, rewarding lives, and I think they deserve that. Today, I invite you to join me on my show to learn from my guests and I how you can be more resilient and strong. I empower people who struggle with confusion or feel stuck in soulless, non-fulfilling situations. I help them find calm and claim their authentic self in their career path or personal life so they can live to their fullest potential. As a motivational speaker for businesses, schools, resorts, and communities, I speak on topics of achieving success and living a mentally healthy lifestyle, featuring topics from my Power My Life program within my revolutionary Impact, Influence, and Income Academy. I inspire the world as a radio journalist, author, life coach, career coach, resilience expert, mental health advocate, and most recently as a society writer for Transatlantic Today magazine. So happy that you joined me. Let's get rolling. You don't just have to go through it, you can grow through it. Good morning, and thank you for joining Resilient You with Alicia Pozsony. On our show, we have guests that talk about topics of importance, and today we're going to talk about something, and I have to give you a trigger warning. This might be something that is triggering to people. It's a sensitive subject, but it is something that is important to cover. Today, a woman who is making a mark, not only in areas of business, but also in personal. And her name is Suzanne Jabour. She is hailing out of Vancouver, Canada. Suzanne, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate hosts like you that are able and willing to go into these more sensitive areas. And what I will add to your trigger warning is that, while talking about grief might be activating for some, my pledge always is that my goal is to have a conversation that makes you want to lean in. It's informational, it's helpful, it's providing what we need to be able to build connection instead of isolation. Because what's happening right now, because we don't talk about grief, is there's a lot of isolation and a lot of fear. So my goal is actually to break that down so that we can show up better for each other. And so that when we're grieving ourselves, we have a little bit of a better idea what might happen and what might occur in that grief process, on that grief journey. So yes, thank you so much for opening up the space to have these kinds of really important, critical conversations that frankly, a lot of us are really scared to have.
Yeah, it's something that, and I'll just share a little bit. So when I was younger, I had a small family, and luckily we didn't have people dying close to us. And so we lived next to a cemetery. So as a girl, I would look out the window and I would see families and gatherings come out to the site. And I felt like I wanted to know what it was about. And I couldn't understand why my mom was so hush hush about it. So with that, Suzanne, you are a grief educator.
Yeah.
You give people support. You are also a transformational life coach. And I'd love for you to tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself.
Yes, a grief educator, which is kind of a weird term for people, but really so encapsulates what I'm about, because my mission now really is to do as much education to break down that fear that I was talking about as I can. And that all comes out of my experience with my most recent loss, which was that of my son, Ben. He died in September of 2020, so 3.5-ish years ago. And that loss, I was grateful in so many ways, which sounds really weird to people who have not grieved the loss of really close loved ones. I was grateful in so many ways that he was not the first person close to me that had died. My dad died now 25 years ago, and my mom 10 years ago. So I had been through those deaths before, those losses. And there was something about the loss of a child. The out of order loss is really just grief on the next level. And I learned very quickly that I didn't know enough about grief in order to be able to do it the way that I wanted to do it. And so much of it felt scary and unknown, and like I didn't understand what was happening to me. And really, I became a student of grief for my own survival. And I wrote about it for the same reason. I just started writing what was happening for me, what I was experiencing, sort of on Facebook, as you do, right? To my friends and family that I was connected to there. And the response that I got was overwhelmingly positive, was overwhelmingly things like, I've never thought about grief that way before. No one ever talked about it so I could understand what they were going through. All of those symptoms you're sharing about, I hadn't really thought about it, but when I look back, I can see, oh yeah, I did have those. And now I feel more equipped for going forward, because grief is going to happen to all of us. It happens to all of us quite regularly, actually, because grief is the natural response to loss of all kinds. So when we broaden our kind of thinking about it away from it just being about the death of a loved one to it being about the loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, a business, moving homes, it's happening to us all the time. And because we have this weird taboo about it and we're not talking about it, we don't get to kind of practice it on those smaller, less rupturing losses.
Mm.
Because someone like me, who's a grieving mom, and I chose to grieve out loud because that was the only way I was going to survive it, I was terrifying, I'm sure. And to step up to support someone there when you haven't built any skills, you don't have a very big understanding, it's really, really hard. And it's really hard for the griever too. And that's why, my passion has become so much about the education piece, because yes, I love coaching individual grievers. I love helping them find their individual path, because it is a unique experience for each of us. While it's universal, it's really an interesting thing that way. It's unique every time, different from my dad, different from my mom, different from my son. And it's universal. We're all going to experience it. That's the only guarantee in life, is that we will have loss. People will die. We will love them and they will die.
Mm.
So not talking about that, as you said so brilliantly, as a little kid, you're just curious. And
Mm.
your mom is holding all of those stories and the fears and the societal conditioning that grief is something we shouldn't talk about. We should just do it quietly. It should be quick, we hope. It's really not. It's loud and messy and it takes a long time. And the
Mhm.
more we understand that and the more we know that, the more equipped we are to show up for each other and for ourselves when we're the one who's grieving.
That's so true. And I know that, you mentioned that when someone is having an unexpected loss, they may not even realize that, well, first, they may not realize they're having a loss as they're going through something in life. So that's
Yeah.
good point to recognize. And then when you have an actual loss of a person, if it's a family member, if it's someone close to you, I know there's probably a lot more to it when it's someone, like you mentioned, out of order loss or a child loss by a parent, even the spousal loss, I know is very difficult for many. So, Suzanne, what is one thing that you want to share with anyone? Is there a way that they can prepare?
Yes, actually, I really feel like the best preparation, because you can't really prepare, right? It's not like you can have, I mean, you could have some casseroles in the freezer, you could do, there's not really practical things you can do to prepare, because most of the time when it happens, it's unexpected, right?
Mm.
Even when it's an older person who's been ill, it still ends up like that final moment ends up usually being unexpected or feel like it's come upon quickly.
Mm.
But what we can do to prepare is really become attuned to our own emotions, because the path through grief and to integration, which is where we want to get to, we're not trying to get over it. We're not trying to move on. That wording and those paradigms don't really serve. What we want to get to is integration, where this grief now is part of our lives. The loss is part of who we are. we get there really by facing it, by turning full into it, and by feeling and allowing all of those emotions.
Mm.
So that really is the best preparation. The more we're in tune with our emotions, the more we allow them to be felt, the more we can name them to a really nuanced level. You know, when I do workshops, I pull up an emotions wheel or a feelings wheel. Google has a million of them. I don't need to make one. You can just Google feelings wheel or emotions wheel. There's a whole bunch of them. And what I love about them is they really help us get past that sort of mad, sad, glad upper level of sort of trifecta of, emotions that, yes, we need to be able to name those, but there's so much nuance, right? We need to understand, when is it sadness and when is it despair, right? Where is it disappointment? When is it exhaustion? When is it, longing? When is it joy? When is it gratitude? When is it appreciation? So, and all of those, from the despair to the gratitude and the joy, exist at the same time in grief.
Mm.
So if we can have a sense of being able to name them at that more nuanced level, what's really fascinating is the science tells us and the researchers show that even if we can just name the emotion, that helps to move them. And
Mm.
what we want to do is keep those emotions moving. So that's why, there's so much fear about grief that if we acknowledge it, if we look at it, if we face it, we'll get stuck. And it's actually the opposite that's true. It's the
Mm.
denial and the trying to box it up and repress it that gets us stuck. The acceptance is what keeps it flowing. So really, that's a great preparatory, it's really good for every aspect of our lives, but it certainly helps us deal with grief better if you have a bit of that nuanced understanding of emotions, if you can talk about them, if you can name them, if you can find a safe space where those conversations become normal.
Mm.
Then when ruptures happen, large or small, you have some spaces where those kinds of conversations are normalized and you're able to say, wow, I'm really disappointed. I'm really elated. I'm really whatever it is, right? Love those feeling wheel. There's a million names for all
Mm.
these emotions and feelings that we have. And being able to name them really is very helpful. And having those safe spaces to have those kinds of conversations, if you've got those set up in advance, I kind of found those on the fly. And it worked out fine, but there were very few people in my pretty robust circle of support that were able to really show up for me, especially in those early days where it just all feels like a storm and a tsunami and you're underwater and you can barely breathe. Like, to show up for someone in that space is really tough. So
Mm.
that's a great sort of preparatory thing, is to have some of those skills and some of those support systems already in place, because we know it's coming. We know it will
Mm.
happen. What can we
Yeah.
do to be more prepared? And
Yeah.
really then understanding grief better, learning more about it as it's happening to you on smaller scales. And even if it's happening to you on a big way, one of the things I had to do was go, wow, I don't even understand what's happening to me. I don't
Mm.
know who I am anymore. My brain doesn't work anymore. I can't sleep. I can't eat. Like, everything is disrupted. And if you know that that's normal, then it's not as scary, because otherwise it's really scary.
Yeah, that's so true. And we had in our family, we had someone who was ill and then passed away, my husband's father. And it was a thing where they were preparing for it over time, right? They knew the end was coming. So they had all the things in place logistically. They arranged for the family to be there. They arranged for the things to be taken care of.
Yeah.
And afterwards, they thought they had everything planned as well, the meals and how they would navigate it. But then it was still a shock because the
Yeah.
grief, and I guess there's different cycles of grief that one might go through. They, it was longer and different, and they felt where they could comfort one another and get through it. It didn't happen that way. And I
Yeah.
think that's true for many people. To your point, I love that. What you say is that realize there will be disruption. You're not going to be yourself. Realize that if you can name the emotions, you can help to keep that moving. And as well, if you don't repress it, you may not get as stuck, right? So
Yeah. And
again,
I
it
think what you're saying that I just want to point out is so important, is that first of all, yes, you can do all the planning you can, and that helps with some of the logistical stuff, right? To know that you're having the service that they wanted and their remains are ending up dealt with how they wanted. All of those things are really, really helpful. And it's important for us to understand that every person grieves differently.
Mhm.
And that so often is what fractures families apart, is that sort of judgment that we hold that either you're grieving too much or not enough or not the right way. Grief is so interesting in that it's one of, I think, the few spots in our shared existence where we have very little knowledge and understanding and a whole lot of judgment.
Mm.
And it's
Right.
so easy to kind of go, oh, yeah, but you're not doing it the same way. And I was so grateful that I really early on understood that I was not going to grieve Ben the same way my daughter was.
Mm.
Right. And in fact, we weren't even grieving the same person. My son and her brother, they don't
Mm.
have the same relationship. We don't have the same memories. Like, we're grieving the same human, but it's a different person to us.
Mm.
And I wanted to, I knew I had to grieve really out loud. I was very public about it. I agree. Anyone who stopped still long enough would hear about it. And
Right.
my daughter didn't want that. She wanted to do it much more privately. And it would have been very easy for us to leap to judgment about each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that would have broken us apart. And I knew that that was not, I wasn't going to let that happen. So I had to let it be okay that we wanted to do it very differently. And neither
Mm.
way is right. Neither way is wrong. There is no right and wrong. There is just your personal experience and allowing you to have that and everyone else to have theirs. Because, yes, as much as we think, oh, we're all going to turn towards each other and we're going to have this beautiful shared experience while we reminisce about our loved one, and it generally doesn't work that way.
That's right. That's right. And I've seen where people actually take the experience and set a time limit. They say, "Oh, I should be over it by now." Right?
Yeah.
Like, "Oh, and again, even though maybe the tears are not happening as frequent or maybe they're not in the house as much, whatever they're going through, there's a process to grieve, right? So there's emotions, there's experiences, there's even belief systems and shared values that you may have with the person that then crop up and make you question
Yeah.
your relationship with yourself even. So can we talk about the resilience and perhaps the ways that people might um if they learn about different ways to cope long term, what can you tell us about that?
So resilience is absolutely a requirement. Like, if you haven't built any before, you're going to now. It's just, there's no other option really except to curl up into a ball, which most of us is not what we choose. And I think it really partly comes from understanding. It partly comes from, the sense that everything we've been told about grief is kind of wrong, right? There's no set timeline. There's no set, this is going to happen and then this and then this and then this. That's never what the authors of that book intended it to mean anyway, but that's how it's been put together in pop culture. That's not how it works. It's a big tangled plate of messy spaghetti, and it ebbs and flows, right? So
Mhm.
what I really realized early on is that even though I felt underwater all the time, like I could barely breathe, I couldn't make sense of the world anymore. Nothing made sense. And that's
Mhm.
okay. That's very normal. And that's what's supposed to happen. Like, if we can lean into some supposed tos that might be helpful, it's
Mhm.
supposed to be disruptive. It's supposed to make you question everything. It's supposed to really make you have to reassess your entire life. And that's
Mhm.
okay. That part shouldn't be a surprise. What it's not supposed to be is tidy or quiet or done in a certain period of time.
Mhm.
It's so interesting. We say to people so often, like, aren't you over that yet? Or like, isn't it time to move on? Or they would want you to be happy, like all these awful, awful cliches and platitudes, which
Mhm.
really we should just never say again,
Mhm.
because the subtext of them is that the person who's saying it is uncomfortable. And the
Mhm.
person who's saying it doesn't want to be around your grief.
Mhm.
And so all that then happens is you end up isolated, because more and more people say those kinds of things, and you realize you just get to grieve by yourself.
Mhm.
And the one universal is that grief needs witnessing.
Mhm.
So we can't do it by ourselves. That resilience comes from understanding that even in those days where you are in a post-apocalyptic nightmare, the sky is dark, the water is over your head, you are actually a cork. And when
Mm,
I realized that I was a cork and not like a piece of bogged down driftwood on the bottom of the ocean floor,
mm,
I knew that every once in a while I would bob to the surface. I could look around, see how the world operated, go, I don't understand that at all. Take a grasp of air, right? A gasping breath, and then be overwhelmed again. So it was that sense of, okay, like I know that I'm going to bob back to the surface.
mm,
And then I can take a breath, I can look around, I'll see some light, and then it's okay if I go back down under. But I will have those touchstones, those moments of a little bit lighter, a little bit more air, a little bit more spaciousness, because the grief really can feel really heavy and
mm,
oppressive and isolating and lonely. And
mm,
so that's part of why, I love coming spaces like this and saying it's okay to show up as a supporter imperfectly
mm,
because we don't know. We're not talking about it. So we don't have any skills or understanding. And if we can start from, as a collective, we're pretty crap at this.
mm.
We really are. We're not
Yeah,
good at it. We don't understand it very well. And that's
yeah.
okay. We can fix that. That's what education does. It fixes that.
Mm,
If we can understand there's no set timeline, right? Often, as much as we're warned about the firsts, the first birthday, the first Father's Day, Mother's Day, anniversary, whatever the situation is, depending on whose loved one it is, the first, whatever,
yeah.
all of those firsts, very difficult. For many people, the second year is actually worse.
Mm, because you,
So culture has kind of expected that the first year has passed. Now you're over it, which you're never
mm,
going to be over it. You're going to carry your loved one with you, right? We're aiming for integration. We don't want to get over it. We're not leaving them behind anywhere.
mm,
But they think that you should never cry. You should never feel sad. Well, that's not going to happen.
mm,
I still have moments where I miss my dad and I feel sad. He's been dead for 25 years.
mm,
And why would I, as a human, ever want to not miss my dad? Of course
mm.
I miss him.
Yeah, yeah.
That's normal.
Right.
It comes from knowing that it's going to take longer, it's going to be messier,
Mm,
and you will navigate it. You will manage, you will survive. Baby step by baby step,
mm,
small choice by small choice, one breath at a time. You will go from acute grief to early grief to, ultimately to integration, to mature grief, where it's just a part of who you are.
mm. Well, these are very good tips and techniques. And I wish I had known you when my father died suddenly years ago. But as a whole, as a society, we've come forward a great deal with learning and education. And so I'm glad you're here in this space to offer this. I'm sorry that you went through what you went through with your son. Um, it's interesting because as I started out when I was younger, didn't have experience to it. Then, now as I'm in this stage of life, people my own age are passing.
Yeah.
And when they happen suddenly, especially, it makes you pause and think, and then to cherish the time that you had with the person. And again, depending on what they were to you, I think that
Mhm.
it can be really hard. Like I'll be at a stoplight and I'll think of something pops. It's at the most inopportune time when those memories
Correct.
come rushing back. And then, it's true. It's like if we're emotional, it's gonna, but I allow it to happen. And that's one thing I want to share with the listeners is
Yeah.
that if you are grieving, what Suzanne is sharing is so valuable that realize that there's not going to be a definite way to grieve, and the process of grieving is not just a 5-step 6-step however many program within so many weeks, months, year. It's not, it's different for everyone. And whenever I have that space for myself and I allow that emotion to come, just like in other experiences, other emotions, it definitely is better because then you can
Hmm.
take that. The second year that you talked about, I've come in contact with some of the clients, the people that I've worked with, and Thanksgiving, for example, they set a place for the person
Yeah.
at the table, and they were kind of like, well, the guests are going to think I'm strange. But no, it's just that they wanted them there. And I've heard of different techniques like that where you can honor the person who has passed, and that helps you to get forward. They may not set that place the following year, but in that time, it's what worked for them.
And you
Also,
might set it forever.
they might, right.
Right. And both are fine. And I think it is really important to think about, what rituals can you put in place? What things can you do that create the space, especially on days where are going to be activating, right? Thanksgiving is one, especially I think in the US where it's so much a bigger deal around family than it is here in Canada. For us, it's Christmas.
Mhm.
Christmas is the time when extended family gathers as opposed to Thanksgiving.
Mm.
But when their birthday is coming, that's going to be an activator. When their anniversary, right? The anniversary of the day that they died is coming. That's going to be an activator. For me, I know I always think more about my parents around Mother's Day and Father's Day, of course.
Right,
Not that I
right.
don't think about them plenty the rest of the time, but we can anticipate some days that are going to be more activating than others. And as you say, other times it's, you're at a red light and there's
Mm.
nothing, like you can't figure out what the activator was at all. But
Right.
something, either a glimpse of something or a song on the radio or a smell, so much of our memories are sensory, and it's a smell or a color or something like that will activate them. And really, as you're saying, that ability to just let it be, we have to give ourselves permission to
Mm.
grieve, to have these emotions. Our culture doesn't give it to us yet. That's my mission, right?
Mm.
Eventually we'll get there as a collective, but we're not there yet, right? We're very uncomfortable with emotions still in the Western world, certainly in North America.
Yeah.
We don't really want to talk about them as much as we should. We're getting better, so much better. But when they're messy and they're ones
Mm.
from the sort of negative emotions list, that whole paradigm of positive and negative emotions is so troubling to me. But those ones are harder for us to talk about. So we have to make extra effort to say, okay, but I have to name those too. And that's okay. They're all emotions. They're all just a message. They're there to teach us something. They're there to be seen and acknowledged. That's it. They're in motion. We want to keep them, they're emotions, energy in motion. Keep them moving. Say hello. Let them go through. We don't have to hold on to them, right? We can hold on to our loved one without being stuck in our grief. Like allowing your grief to lighten and allowing your grief to be a moving, flowing thing that ebbs
Mm.
and flows still honors your loved one. It's no more honoring of them for you to stay stuck in the wallowing and in the muck than it
Mm.
is for you to allow it to ebb and flow and live a beautiful, resilient, full life.
Yeah, that's so true. It's, in a lot of what I do, I refer to quotes, I refer to experts or people who've come before me. And, there was one quote, something like, I give myself permission to be who I am and just as I am today. And I always kind of think about that because it's so important if you're going through something to know that you're human and you don't have to be a certain expectations view of yourself, right? That you can be resilient, that you can be who you are, learn and grow. And in doing so, you really end up being a better person and a better example for others.
Yeah. And I actually think that the us that we're here to be is actually quite messy,
Mm.
right? We're not here to be, surface perfect and closed down. Like we're here to be messy. We're here to learn about love. We're here to learn about each other. And I think the more we can be vulnerable, the more we can be honest about what's really happening,
Mm.
the more we can build connection. And I think, especially coming out of the pandemic, as it continues and, we watch people still getting sick and the numbers ebbing and flowing, we had so much loss
Mm.
of human life at unprecedented levels, of experiences, of
Mm.
businesses, of homes. We lost so much. And we're so grief phobic that we don't want to talk about it. And when
Mm.
we talk about it, it moves, right? When we talk
Mm.
about it, we're connected with each other. You sharing your stories of your childhood next to the graveyard, the cemetery, the
Mm.
loss of your dad, your memories at the stoplights, right? Me sharing my stories of, feeling like I was underwater. That connects us. We now feel connected to each other,
Mm.
right? And it's
Right.
because we're being honest and vulnerable. If I
And
showed
one,
up and said, "Oh yeah, grief is no big deal and it wasn't really that awful," and you say, "Yeah, it's not a big deal to me either," there's no connection there, right? There's
Mhm.
nowhere to go. And I
Yeah.
think what we're seeing in people's levels of fear and levels of uncertainty, a lot of it is that repressed grief that we're not talking about. It's those big repressed emotions that we all
Mhm.
felt and continue to feel. And that's okay. Messy is good.
Well, there's one big grief moment in my life that I want to bring up with you today because who knows,
Yeah,
maybe you can help me with it further, but
absolutely.
it's not over a person.
Hmm.
It's over a job. It's
Wow.
over a career. Like I was a career coach for 10 years, and in doing so, I help people to bridge the gap in between where they were, where they wanted to be, and sometimes where they were, if they ended up somewhere they didn't want to be to get to that new job. Well, in that counseling and coaching, they had to come to terms with something. Well, I never expected to be on the receiving end of that. I was a independent contractor. I worked for many years doing whatever was asked to complete assignments ahead of budget and ahead of time schedules. And so I got good at it. And when I finished a job, it was a 6 month job. I finished it in 4 months. I was ready to get
Wow.
hired. With the company was growing, so I thought I'm ready to move. Well, they showed up on Friday and walked me to the door. And I was never fired. I was never let go. I It really hit me hard. And my husband didn't understand it. He's like, "No problem. You're a contractor. You'll just get a new job." But at that point in my life, I think I had realized that something else was going on there. And anyway, so I was getting my validation from external, and I
Yep.
realized that that wasn't. But in the grief stages, it became difficult. So I went to counseling, and I said, "I don't understand. Why am I so hung up on this?" And the counselor was kind of the same, like, just, you know what, you'll just find something else. It wasn't meant to be. And but like, I really feel I feel that that was grief. It was
Absolutely it
actual.
was.
It was probably like 4 months when I
Yeah.
could talk about it comfortably. Like I didn't, it was really difficult. So when you said at the beginning of this talk that grief can be other things other than the loss of life, that really spoke to me. Do you
Yeah.
have any thoughts for me or others who might be
Yeah. 100%.
grieving things that they didn't expect they would grieve, or grieving as hard as they?
As they are. Yeah. I think there's a couple of things that are really important to understand. 100% you're right. That was grief. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, right? You've lost a job. Yes, as a contractor, but still, you expected to stay contracting maybe with that company, maybe in that field, right? You've been, unceremoniously walked to the door. There's a whole bunch to grieve there, right? Because it's a loss of dignity. It's a
Mm,
loss of what respect. It's a loss of your identity,
mm,
right? How much of your identity was tied up into, this is what I do. I'm a contractor and I come in as a consultant and I help you finish your project under budget and before time. And I do it really well.
yeah.
And now all of a sudden I'm not doing that. And I don't know who I am if I don't do that. Right.
Mm,
There's also that sense that if we don't allow ourselves to grieve, the grief just kind of adds on to each other. So Chris Carr just wrote a brilliant book about grief called I'm Not a Mourning Person. I'm not a punny person, but I do appreciate that one. So she spells it
mm.
Mourning. I'm not a morning person. Right?
Okay.
So good. Anyway, she talks about the grief train. And I just love this analogy because basically what happens is if you don't allow yourself to grieve, so if you don't allow yourself to grieve this loss of a job and the attached identity, purpose, meaning you make out of your life, place you spend your time, people you socialize with, there's a huge amount of losses attached to a job that we
Mm,
tend to gloss over. That car attaches to your grief train, right?
mhm,
If we don't allow ourselves to grieve, right, to allow the emotions, to talk about it, to work through it, it just attaches to our train. And then
mm,
when another loss comes, the whole grief train pulls in.
mm,
So our goal is to keep that train as short as possible. So we want to grieve the loss of the job so that when we lose something else, whatever the next thing is, whether it's a loved one that dies or an opportunity or a pet or a home or whatever, there's only one thing on our grief train. It's the loss we're grieving right now. right? We want to keep that train as short as possible. I love, love, love that analogy because it
That.
helps us to see, oh, this is actually really valuable. Grief is really valuable
Mm,
because it keeps our emotions clear. It keeps us flowing. It keeps us going, oh, yeah, like that was a really big loss. And the other thing that I want to riff on is what people are saying to you. And this is very much our North American culture. There's a better job out there. You'll just get something else. It's their loss, right? We all say all of these kinds of things.
mm,
What difference would it have made to you in that time if either your husband or a friend or the counselor, please should have been the counselor, had said, you know what? I know that you're going to come out of this okay. But before we talk about what you might do next, before we go to strategizing your next moves, I
mm.
bet you're feeling some kind of way about this. I bet you have a whole bunch of emotions about this. And let's talk about those first,
True, true. So
right?
that's,
We
yeah,
have to
that's so
pause
true.
and feel the emotions, feel the feelings,
Mm,
allow that to be okay. And then we can go to, we're so good at the cheerleading piece, right? You're so great. It's their loss. There'll be something better. It wasn't for you, whatever. There's a million of those kinds of things we say to people.
yeah,
We're
yeah.
really great at strategizing, right? Okay, well, let's pull out. I don't even know how people find jobs these days. Indeed, LinkedIn, the classifieds feel so old fashioned. I don't think that's the way, right? Let's figure out who's in your network, all the new ways that we
Yeah.
find jobs. That strategizing, we're really good at that, but we're not really good at the emotions piece. And that's the piece that needs to come first.
Mm,
Because
yes.
had you had a space where you could have said, oh my gosh, I'm so disappointed. I feel so embarrassed that they like marched me to the front door in front of
Mm,
my peers. I
right.
feel so sad that this piece of myself doesn't feel like it's there anymore. And I know I'll get myself back, but there's a piece now that I don't know what to do about. I'm so confused that
Mm,
I did such a great job for them and then they just kind of marched me out the door. Like,
mm,
if you could have had the space to name all of those things,
yeah.
then they could
That's,
have moved more quickly. Whereas when people are saying, oh, like, I don't know what you're going on about, like, there's something better out there, it's their loss, then you feel like all of those emotions aren't allowed and they're not helpful when it's actually the opposite. We need to allow them, we need to embrace them as helpful, and then go to, all right, back up on our horse, whatever analogy you want to use, right? Rub some dirt in
yeah.
it, keep going, keep playing the game, whatever it is, right? Then
Right,
we can
right.
go to those, but we have to let ourselves feel it first and name it and be like, oh, like, yeah. And sometimes, right, the death of a loved one, that emotional part is really big and unwieldy and overwhelming. And it takes a long time to work your way through it, to find your way to what feels like sanity again, right?
Mm,
With the loss of a job, it won't take that long, but it still needs to be done, right? We still need to go, oh yeah,
mm.
I'm grieving this. This is grief. And grief is this umbrella of all of these big messy emotions. Which ones can I name right now? Which ones am I feeling right now?
Yeah, that's so true. And again, here I was like a mother of two. I was in my late 30s. I lived a life and I didn't
Yeah.
know to call it that. I didn't know that that's what it was. I didn't know I had a right to even experience
Yes.
it as such, right? So that
Yeah.
I love this episode. I love this learning and lessons that we're putting out there into the world. Thank you for that example. So listeners, pick up that book. I'm not a morning person. And I love that about the grief train, how it adds on. That really helps to
Yeah.
give us a picture of what it looks like if you don't experience it and don't learn about it. And even for others, you might see that grief train on someone else. And
Yes.
after hearing Suzanne, after connecting with her, and please go out there and look up her online. You can find her, Jabour is the spelling of her last name. She has different resources online. And Suzanne, you want to tell people about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on all the social places. Okay, I'm not on TikTok because it's just scary to me still. I can't figure it out. I'm a bit of an old dog. But Instagram and Facebook is Suzanne Jabour Grief Education. On LinkedIn, I'm just there as Suzanne Jabour. The best place really to start is on my website, which is again, suzannejabour.com. I'm sure it's all going to be in whatever notes that you put on the episode. But yeah, that's the best place to start. There's free resources there. You can grab the ebook. You can, there's other downloadable things. My schedule, if I have upcoming workshops or programs, is always there. And if you love podcasts, then you can go to suzannejabour.com/podcasts. And I will email you a list of it. There's about 10 or 15 on any given time because we switch it up, but of my sort of favorite recent episodes. So if you loved this conversation, everyone is a little bit different because the host always, I love, love, love. Thank you so much for bringing a host that brings their own experience. So we get to talk about that. So everyone's a little bit different. There's ones where I tell more about my personal story. There's ones where it's all business focused. What can you do at your workplace where people are suffering, where it's costing you money? How can we fix that piece? Lots of them are about that. That's one of my big passion points and places that I work. So yeah, SuzanneJabour.com for all the things.
Wonderful. Suzanne, thank you so much for being on our show. If
Thank
anyone is dealing with grief, please reach out to her. If you know someone who's going through grief and you want to learn more, connect with her for free resources. And as well, grief is something, as she said, that should not be rushed. It should not be minimized. It should not be labeled. So please be sure to know that grief is valuable. And I think that if you're listening to this episode, you'll learn that you don't have to just sit there in sadness or be confused. You can move forward with this education and learn that what you're going through is normal. One breath at a time. Thank you. This is Alicia Pozsony with Resilient You. Thank you so much.